This past weekend, Vladimir Putin won re-election as Russia's president for the second consecutive time and fourth overall, quite handily, with 76% of the vote. Russian expert, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and Amherst College political science professor emeritus William Taubman sat down with me to discuss the ins and outs of Putin's time in office.
It was a little more than he got last time, and the turnout was a little more than last time. Frankly, I don't like President Putin that much, and therefore I have to admit I was hoping for a smaller turnout and a smaller vote.
Interesting when we look at vote percentage that he's received. If we go way back to the 90s, when he was tapped by Yeltsin to basically land in the presidency, that following election, I think he received 53% and then something in the 70s. How is it that he's been able to build on the percentage that he's received?
It turns out that President Putin answers to something in the Russian political culture and maybe even in the national character, if such a thing exists. He is a tough guy. He doesn't say too much. He's very decisive. And in contrast to somebody like Gorbachev or Yeltsin, he seems solid and strong. And the Russians like a strong hand president.
And so his favorability there is high then?
Yes, his favorability ratings, I think, are even higher than his vote. They've been in the 80s.
And so how does that compare to, well, there aren't that many predecessors for him since this new government, but how does this compare for him? You know, Medvedev, how did he do?
Well, Medvedev, I don't remember exactly what his numbers were. He inherited, for the 4 years he replaced Putin's popularity. But I think Russians prefer Putin. I mean, it's strange because he's really unprepossessing as a person. He's not big, he's not strong.
But he certainly, the media internationally has helped him sort of carry that off, right? I mean, everyone thinks of that one picture of him shirtless on a horse where he's sort of very powerful in that image, and that's what he likes to portray?
Yes. You know, there's an interesting irony. When the British started complaining about the poisoning of this former Soviet spy in London, Putin laughed it off and said, this is stupid. We would never do anything like that on the eve of our election. The theory being, of course, it would hurt us. But since the election, the commentators have been saying that it helped him because it fit the picture of Russia as besieged by the West, criticizing them for this, among other things, and that helped Putin. So if you really want to be clever and shrewd and imagine that he is clever and shrewd, you might say they did it just to get that reaction. They'd get protests from the West, feel besieged, and he would gain from it rather than lose.
Because certainly the international community does not look favorably on President Putin. We saw that the New York Times reported that the election was actually moved, right, to be on the 4th anniversary of Russia's decision to annex Crimea. Do you think that that was purposely to show more of this strength and bluster on President Putin's part?
Absolutely, absolutely. The Russian annexation of Crimea was hugely popular in Russia and in Crimea.
Yet the international community has, sanctioned the country and looks upon it very unfavorably. So there's a contrast there.
Well, the international community doesn't like the fact that Putin was breaking the norms that have kept the peace since World War II, that one country doesn't grab another country's territory. But for the Russians, Crimea felt Russian. It was Russian for a long time, and they wanted it back. And when he took it back by force, they loved it.
And of course, so here, the media has talked a lot about the fact that Putin took control of this election. The Elections Commission, we saw, decided not to let the only member of the opposition who was interested in running against Mr. Putin even make it to the ballot. Had Alexei Navalny's name been added to the ballot, do you think, how would he have fared, do you think?
Well, we know that when he ran for mayor of Moscow and was allowed to do that a few years ago, he got 27 or 8% of the vote.
Which is seen as a
well,
significant
that's good,
or insignificant?
because in this election, the second candidate to come in, the communist candidate, Grudinin, got 11% of the vote. Now, Moscow is a urban, emancipated, relatively liberal voting electorate, And so Navalny, had he run, would not have gotten that much, I presume, around the rest of Russia. But still, he would have come in second with better numbers than the current second-place candidate.
Let's talk about term limits, because Russia does have them. And we saw that Mr. Putin didn't get to run another third consecutive term. He took that break, and that's when we saw Mr. Medvedev become president. Putin's tapped to be the prime minister, and now he gets to run again. How is it with their term limits that he's able to do that?
Well, I think the Constitution said you couldn't have more than 2 terms in a row. So he was very clever. He served his 2 terms, turned it over to Medvedev for 1 term, and then ran for another 2 terms. And this is the second of that second pair. So the real test will come in 2024, because then he should be finished. But it's certainly possible that he will change the Constitution, or he'll invent some higher position that's not in the current Constitution, like the Ayatollah Khamenei, who's the supreme leader of Iran, or Deng Xiaoping in China became the sort of chairman of everything. So it's quite possible Putin will invent a way for himself to serve more than 24 years.
Let's look at the sanctions that have been placed on Russia by our current president, Mr. Trump. This happened last Thursday in advance of those elections, after there was a lot of criticism lobbed at Mr. Trump for not having put sanctions on Russia for having meddled in our elections here in this country. Do you think that those sanctions being laid out last Thursday, was that a strategic move by our president?
I think it was a tactical move. That is to say, it was less than a major step. The main sanctions have already been placed on Russia. These were a few extra ones, not even as many as Congress has authorized. And I just read online before coming into the studio that President Trump has called Putin to congratulate him. And in talking about the phone call, which he said went very well, he said he plans to meet with Putin very soon to talk about limitations on the arms race.
And what does that mean? I mean, the significance of that.
Well,
we've seen that in the past.
The significance of that is that Trump is not giving Putin the cold shoulder. Apparently, after he did this, Senator McCain of Arizona criticized Trump for saying, "Why did you bother to congratulate a dictator who deprived a lot of his people of a chance to vote for Navalny?" Well, I can understand why Trump did that. I mean, one president congratulates another even when the other one isn't an angel.
Right. It seems a polite thing
but this
to do.
goes to show that Trump is still interested in trying to talk to Putin and make some sort of deal.
Even in light of the fact that we know, based on research that's been done by our own government agencies, that this country did meddle to help to elect President Trump.
I think that and the huge reaction, negative reaction to that in the United States, has held Trump back from meeting with Putin sooner and pushing sooner for a bigger deal. But he hasn't given up entirely on that, and frankly, I can understand that too. I mean, I think the tensions between Russia and the United States are too high. They shouldn't be that high. We still have some common interests, even though we have a lot of interests and conflicts. So I don't blame Trump for trying to see Putin. It depends what kind of arrangements or deal he works out.
For you, you've long written about this subject. You're a political scientist here in the region, but you've written about this, biographies about Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Khrushchev, which you won a Pulitzer for. For you personally, what's your interest in this region?
Well, if you're asking why I got interested in it in the beginning, that takes us back 50 years, I'm afraid. It was partly because growing up, I was fascinated by the Cold War. Khrushchev and Eisenhower, Kennedy and Khrushchev. My mother's parents, my grandparents on my mother's side, actually came from Russia and spoke Russian. My mother didn't. So somewhere in that, I got interested in Russia. But as I got older and as I studied Russia, I didn't lose the interest. I gained even more interest. It's a fascinating, mysterious country, as Churchill said, a mystery wrapped inside an enigma. And I've been trying to figure it out for 50 years, and I still haven't figured it out.
Well, we appreciate you taking some time to help us understand a bit of it today.